Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. The Charleswood Historical Society was formed in 1974 at the suggestion of the local councillor, Al Koopman. Its first president was a councillor by the name of Ernie Vielu. And thanks to the foresight of those people, we've managed to collect and preserve a lot of Charleswood memories. We have a newly revamped museum at 5006 Robin Boulevard, just west of the fire hall. And the Society also maintains a lovely heritage property that I'll be talking about later in my presentation. We have a very popular lecture series, which normally takes place once a month, but it's been put on hold due to COVID. We've covered such topics as the history of streetcar in Winnipeg, who was Prince Rupert anyway, the British Home Child Program, and bird identification. But for now, I hope to give you a little insight of how Charleswood has evolved over the years. I had the good fortune of growing up in Charleswood in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And at that time, the community was pretty small and everyone knew everyone. So you had to be really careful what kind of mischief you got into. Life was pretty simple then, but I'm going to start a little bit further back than that. There's evidence of human activity in the Charleswood Headingley area dating back to, well, a few thousand years. Nomadic indigenous people hunting bison passed through the area. Many projectile points from a number of sites across Manitoba and as far away as South Dakota were discovered here. Our Historical Society is very appreciative that the university has loaned these artifacts to us to display in our museum. Now, the archaeological site, I think I missed that, was on the Kuiper site in 1972 and 1980. And it's in the Assiniboine Landing area. So we're going to go a few kilometers east of this site, what we've kind of called Charleswood Historic Square Mile. And if you can take a little look here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ferry passage and Kelly Landing. And the Charleswood School is going to come into play and Kelly's store. And right around where the Charleswood School and Kelly's store is, that's where the current Charleswood Legion is. So we've got Municipal Road and then Berkeley Street, which is going to come into play a lot, and then west of Charleswood Road. So some of the significant locations are the Passage, which is at the top, the school and the landing, which I mentioned. So I think we've covered that pretty well. So along the Assiniboine River, at the northeast corner of Berkeley Street, is Manitoba's most significant historic site, one of them. This site is known as the Passage, and it's here that thousands of bison cross the Assiniboine River, thundering through the woods and along Beaver Dam Creek. I'm going to click down here. And as they went through that area, they went straight kind of south and to the west past Charleswood Road to graze out in the open prairie. This historic crossing was also used by Indigenous people, Métis hunters, traders, and settlers. It was an ideal crossing as the banks were not steep and the water was quite shallow. The names of many of these people are familiar to us today. Chief Peguis, Miles MacDonald, Jean-Baptiste Lagimodiere, Lord Selkirk, and Cuthbert Grant. In their time, the traditional river crossing was known as the Grand Passage. It was the most significant route north and south across the Assiniboine River. So we have plaques commemorating the passage at the site. The Hudson Bay Company came to own and control this area, and in 1857, they surveyed and divided the land on both sides of the Assiniboine River into river lots. These lots originally ran 2 miles back from the river, and they were either 6 chain lots or 12 chain lots wide. And each chain is equal to 66 feet. So that would be about 390 feet across. The area at the time was known as Assiniboia. Its boundary to the east and on the north side of the Assiniboine was Boundary Street, which we now know as Maryland. And on the south, it encompassed where St. Mary's Academy now sits. And to the west, it went as far as St. Francis Xavier, which is about 3 miles west of Headingley. So the settlers on the south side of the river would row their goods across the river with their horses swimming behind. Then their Red River carts would be loaded up on the north bank with their and they would use the only trail available on the north shore. This trail, which became known as Portage Avenue, was just a mud trail, and there were no bridges over the creeks along the way. So this meant a lot of unloading and reloading the carts to pass over the streams. The Red River carts were always left on the north side of the river, as there were no roads in Charleswood at the time. And it wasn't until 1865 that Roblin Boulevard, often referred to as Skunk Alley, was cut out of dense bush, and it was just wide enough to accommodate an ox cart. By this time, a number of Métis families had settled in the area: the Branconiers, the Morissettes, the Hogues, and the Boschmans. Jean-Baptiste Boschman was born in 1838 and in the Red River settlement of St. Boniface. He came to this area in 1859. Mr. Boschman became a councillor in the Legislative Assembly of Louis Riel's provisional government in 1870. He and his wife, Marguerite Macmillan, had 4 children, and their son Bill was actually born while on the buffalo hunt. Jean-Baptiste died in 1900 at the age of 62, and Marguerite died in 1926 at the age of 86. So Boschman Park is located just west of Berkeley Street North on the site of their former home. And by that time, in the late 1860s and 70s, many boats known as paddle steamers were used to carry settlers, their belongings, and livestock out west to Portage la Prairie and Brandon areas. The Hermitage, which is now part of Headingley, was, at the time, one of the most noted residential homes in the area and was a popular gathering place for neighbors. It was built by W.B. Hall, who was considered the pioneer nurseryman of Manitoba. And he grew fruit trees of many varieties, and his work was so respected that in 1880, the Dominion government obtained samples of his fruit to be sent to Ottawa and Toronto for display purposes. So it was here at the Hermitage that cordwood was gathered, which was used to power the steamers going west. And it was picked up there. The boats didn't use the steam on the eastern return trips, as they just coasted along with the current. They carried all kinds of cargo, farm produce such as wheat, oats, and barley to Fort Garry. But with the coming of the CPR, the steamboat subsided, and the last steamboat traveled west to Winnipeg in 1911 with a cargo of hay. In the west end of Charles, there's a lovely green space along the Assiniboine River called Cairn Park. Cairn House and the St. Charles ferry crossing are 2 historic sites at this location. Because of shallow water, the original ferry crossing was eventually moved from the Grand Passage, which we spoke about at Berkeley Street. It was moved further west to this site, just west of Cairn House. And the view that you're seeing of the church is actually just looking across the river to St. Charles Church. So we have plaques dedicated at the site that tell the story of the ferry, which serviced the area for 50 years. It went out of service when the Headingley Bridge was completed in 1920. So this is the ferry crossing then. And this is the ferry crossing now. So in 1880, Charles and George Cairn, they were distant cousins to each other, came out west with their families from Quebec to the parish of St. Charles. And Charles's father, Mr. LaFleche, came out for a visit and soon moved his family here to join them. The Cairns purchased 2,400 acres of farmland, which ran from what is now known as Willow Ridge, west to the perimeter, and south from the Assiniboine River to the 4 Mile Road. They built a wooden frame home, farm buildings north of where this house stands, which isn't far north because the river is only about 50 yards away. This included a dairy farm, a cheese factory, a blacksmith shop, and a windmill. George obtained his degree in agriculture, and while continuing to farm, he also worked for several years as an asylum inspector for the province of Manitoba. Charles and Amadine had 4 sons and 7 daughters, and George and his wife, Virginie, had 4 daughters. The Cairn House that remains is the one that you're seeing here. It was built by George in 1905, and it's the last remaining farmhouse on the Assiniboine River inside the perimeter. The house has had a wonderful history of 2 founding Charleswood families, the Cairns and the LaFleches. The Cairns, probably about 15 years ago, had a family reunion, and I think there was only about 500 people that were able to attend. Only, yeah. So in later years, the house, after passing ownership, was left unoccupied. And unfortunately, kids began to party in there, and there was an incredible amount of damage that was done. So in the 1980s, the Charleswood Historical Society fought hard to save the house from demolition, and they undertook the task to restore and reserve the property. And there were a lot of people that were against saving it. So this view is just actually from the river. The Historical Society attained heritage designation for Cairn House and found tenants to live there to prevent further destruction. So we've raised funds and applied for grants to finance a great amount of restoration work that was needed. Some of the features of the house were salvaged from the home of the Chapman family, and we'll talk about that family later. The house is only open for Doors Open Winnipeg on special occasions, but you can still enjoy seeing this lovely park and reading up on the ferry crossing. So the river lots were thriving, and there were lots of fish to be caught, and there was lots of bush for fuel. And while there were guns for hunting game, cattle had become a necessity as the buffalo had become scarce. And it was around this time that the government extended the river lots 2 miles, which would provide more land for growing hay to sustain the cattle. So when I was growing up out in Charleswood, none of this existed. Like, it was all open fields as far as you could see. Cairn House was there, but I mean, it was just that little bit further away from us. And so Westdale didn't exist. River West Park didn't exist. It was all just cattle land. So now the pasture is now given away to a beautiful neighborhood. Around 1894, River Road, now known as Robin Boulevard, was surveyed to 66 feet wide. And it was built in 1912 at 94 feet wide. So we're going to move a little east again, and we're now going to be back in the vicinity of Charleswood's historic square mile in the passage. So these are my great-grandparents, Patrick, Kelly, and Mary Grace Stock, and they came to Manitoba from Kincora, Ontario, with their family of 11 in about 1906. They purchased lots 60 and 61 from Antoine Hogue and settled in the area between what we now know as Municipal Road and Charleswood Road. Berkeley Street at the time was called Ferry Road. So this property overlooked the passage and was soon known to become Kelly's Landing. They had a successful farm with an orchard on the property. And in 1970, let me take a step back. They had a successful farm with an orchard on the property, and Patrick became very involved in the community. In 1907, he set up a general store, a post office, and a real estate office. It was beside where the current Legion is. In 1908, with Assiniboia Reeves, George Chapman, and the support of Sir Rodmond Roblin, Patrick lobbied for the extension of Charleswood's first electric streetcar, with the store location as its terminus. The first day the streetcar ran was on a Sunday, and my great-grandfather said, "It's here, so we better use it." So he bundled up the family to ride down to Mass at St. Ignatius. So about 20 years ago, Len Van Roon Sr., a longtime family friend going back to my mom's generation, relayed a story to me about the streetcar that I hadn't heard before. Back then, Roblin Boulevard had quite a hill rising from Berkeley Street to Charleswood Road. As I mentioned, the streetcar, the end of the street line, was just in front of my great-grandfather's store between Municipal and Berkeley. Well, unfortunately, the new conductor on the line was unaware of this. He just saw the hill ahead of him 2 blocks away and figured he better power up the streetcar so he could climb the hill. Needless to say, there was quite a crash when they hit the end of the line and the streetcar derailed. There were only 3 riders left on the car at the time: my grandmother, my aunt, and a neighbor. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but I imagine the poor conductor's ego might have been a little bit bruised. The streetcar ran until the 1930s, and apparently the very next day, the electric version stopped. The electric version stopped. The gas streetcar began operation. So in 1912, the municipality of Charleswood was formed. And in 1913, the first municipal council met in Kelly's General Store. This location served as council chamber for a time. It even had a pool table in the back. There was a favorite gathering, pardon me, 521. I apologize for this. I got ahead of myself. There are 3 stories as to the origin of the name of Charleswood. One is that it was named after Charles Kelly, who served on the first municipal council. Another, that it was named after the parish of St. Charles and the natural woodland feature of the area. And the third was that it was named because there were no streets on the north side of the river, so people would come across the river to Charles Caron's property for wood, thus Charles's Wood, Charleswood. So after 1914, the council met in the Charleswood School, the present site of Boschman Park Place, just east of the Charleswood Legion. This large red brick school was built to replace a log 1-room schoolhouse. Originally called Boschman School, the name was changed to Charleswood School, but we all still refer to it as the Red Brick School. It held classes from grade 1 to grade 11, and the school closed in 1956. After that, the Royal Canadian Legion branch took over the building until a new Legion was built, and this building was demolished in 1969. And we still have the cornerstone from the school, thanks to Cy Flood. A friend of mine remembers having to do a fire drill. And there's an old tin slide on the north side of the school. And she said the slide was in such wretched condition that it had bolts sticking out and tin peeled back. She said it was amazing they didn't have serious injuries. Okay, so back to Mr. Kelly. After getting established in the area, Mr. Kelly built another large house on Roblin Boulevard. And in his later years, he moved into a smaller home just opposite to the store that he built when he first arrived in Charleswood, which would have been right by this school. And we looked at that on the little map we had earlier. So after the ferry moved from Kelly's Landing, the landing may have continued as a location to land and transport goods, but by the 30s and 40s, became known as the south side of Easy Reach Beach. So this would have been at the north end of Berkeley. And so on the opposite side of the river would have been pretty much Rouge Road. The Kelly property was well loved area for picnics and parties. And in the 50s and 60s, it was a great woodland playground for kids away from the supervision of parents and the constant warning, don't go near the river. The favorite gathering spot was large clearing dominated by a huge elm tree. Patrick's wife, Mary Grace, passed away in 1921 and Patrick in 1939. Now there's a stone marker indicating where Kelly's Landing is at the end of Berkeley Street, but the entrance is quite sloped and it's a little dangerous getting in there. There's another entrance further down South Boyne, and it's identified by a City Winnipeg sign, but the park, you can enter it from South Boyne, but the park actually runs behind a lot of fancy houses and the river. So when I was a kid, none of these parks existed in any formal way. It was just mostly wide open spaces, open fields that you could cut through to get to school, and sometimes with a little trepidation of the horses. Lots of people in those days had horses, and you know, we really didn't know anything about the passage. We were just kids playing down to the river, boys chasing the girls with crayfish, and seeing how far we could skip stones across the river. Eisenberg's store. Well, I grew up on Municipal Road, on the street right across from Legion, where the tank is. And in my youth, the southwest corner of Municipal Road and Roblin, there were honeysuckle bushes and a path that led behind the original Charleswood Credit Union and an establishment known as the Chip Stand. Izzy Eisenberg owned the Chip Stand, and they sold French fries, hot dogs, hamburgers, ice cream. And in this picture, the Chip Stand would have been just to the left of the store that you see. And people would walk for blocks to pick up their orders. And I remember the fries were wrapped in newspaper to keep them warm until we arrived home. Now, a true story. My older brother, at the age of about 8 or 10, was just sitting in the house and he's looking out the window and he sees a car go by with a monkey on the roof. And, you know, that's not something you see every day in Charleswood. So he runs out the door and he's running down the street to catch all the action. And we only lived about 100 yards, so he knew they had to stop at the corner. So he has this great time. He's watching the local RCMP officer and the owner of this monkey trying to catch this thing in one of those old apple baskets. So he had a great time with that. And, you know, about 2 years ago, I was in the Charleswood Museum and this woman comes in and she asked this other person who was there about this monkey, if anybody out here had owned a monkey. Right. And so I said, well, yeah, I know something about this monkey. And she says her dad used to bring her out to Charleswood when he had business with this man that owned this monkey. And so she actually got to see this thing. So that was just another little plug to the story. Another time, one of the bison got loose from the Assiniboine Park. We're not sure how they caught him. But so the corner store would go on to become Crozer's store, which became Pottinger's store, and then the West End Food Mart. One of our neighbors, a few doors down the street from us, had his still blow up. I think there was probably on a first name basis with the local volunteer fire department, but then maybe they were customers, who knows. One of my favorite memories is hiking or biking down to the train tracks. At that time, there was a first mile track and the second mile track. We would take a bologna sandwich, a jar of Kool-Aid in a brown paper bag, and we'd sit and wave at the engineers and conductors as they went by. And you could hear the meadowlarks. And to this day, when I'm on my bike, I feel like I'm 10 years old again. And it's such a treat to hear the sound of the meadowlark. So Dan and Grace Flood. Well, Daniel Flood Park is named after my grandfather. His family came from Lucan in southern Ontario, just north of London in 1905. They settled originally in River Heights, across from St. Ignatius School. Daniel, the seventh in a family of 12, came out to Manitoba a number of years after his parents. He met and married Mary Grace Kelly, daughter of Patrick, who we spoke about earlier. And it was then that Daniel moved to Charleswood, building a house on the north side of Roblin Boulevard at the top of the hill near Charleswood Road. As their family grew, he built a second home, two lots east of the original home. And though this house has greatly changed, it still remains. He worked in the grain field, and he also had an extensive garden, some chickens, possibly a few cows, a red barn, and a garage. Dan and Grace had 7 children, and one child, Daniel Edward, who died at birth. The flood home was a busy gathering place with badminton often played in the yard. They were very involved in the community, and the first meeting of the Charleswood Credit Union was held in their home. My grandfather passed away in 1954, and my brother Danny recalls a line of mourners' cars stretched all the way down the hill as far as one could see. Over the years, my grandmother, Grace, kept busy with her many grandchildren and visitors, as well as involvement with her church and community events. And in 1959, she was asked to cut the ribbon to open the new perimeter bridge. She passed away in 1974. Of the family, Cyril, Patrick, and my mom, Alice Furlan, raised their families in Charleswood. Many of Dan and Grace's 33 grandchildren lived in Charleswood. And as the community grew, I grew up in a family of 7 kids. We lived next door to my aunt and uncle and their family of 8. So we had cousins and second cousins 1 block over on Berkeley Street, all over the place. So this park, Daniel Flood, the land was formerly on the home where James Richardson's family lived. And when I was growing up out here, Richardsons had sheep roaming their property. And in the fall, the leaves on the trees changed to such a deep red, they looked absolutely stunning. It was like the forest was on fire. This is Moog Park. And in 1914, Bill and Ann Moog arrived separately from Scotland. They met and married in Canada. They began coming out to Charleswood in 1921 and to farm on the Hearthstone farm, which is up on Wilkes between Hearthstone and Community. They'd stay on the farm in the summer and lived on Erin Street in the winter. They moved to Charleswood in 1923 and in the spring of 1926, settled permanently. They moved into their Charleswood home on Berkeley Street South. Bill was a delivery man for the Hudson Bay Company and served as a trustee on the school board for several years until his death in 1936. Each of their children received their education at Charleswood School. Their son, Art, joined the Army at age 17, and in 1952, he established Berkeley Construction. And Art served as mayor of Charleswood from 1966 until 1971, when he became part of the city of Winnipeg and served as MLA from 1969 to 1977. And there's many descendants of the Moog family still in the area. So now we're going to move a little over to the east side of Charleswood. You might be familiar with the old stone building located just west of the Charleswood Bridge on the north side of Roblin. This is the Oddfellows home. It was built in 1922, and it was built for elderly members and orphaned members of orphaned children of deceased members of the Oddfellows Lodge. It served as a school for their dependents, and it accommodated 70 people with additional capacity in the attic for more people. There were 2 large playrooms in the basement of the building, and you can still see on the north side, as we're looking at the south side, separate entrances, one for the girls and one for the boys at the back of the building. It later became a nursing home, and it closed in 1997 after funding from the provincial government was withdrawn. But it opened again in 2001 as assisted living residence, Assiniboine Links. This is now a private subdivision between the building and the river. Now, up until 1972, Grant Avenue didn't exist out in Charleswood. There was a gravel road called Headley, which ran from the junction of Roblin and Grant, and it ran just to around the Charleswood Curling Club. So it stopped there, and in those days, the Charleswood Golf Course ran south all the way across where Grant now is. Headley then started up on the other side, the east side of the golf course, and stopped at Chalfont. So the way east after Chalfont was blocked by the fabulous Assiniboine forest. And so the first 2 lanes of Grant didn't get constructed all the way through from Shaftesbury until 1972. And then the other 2 lanes were put in 1974. So I actually went to Tuxedo Shaftesbury for most of my high school years. And it was a bit of an ordeal at the time because, you know, you'd take the bus, it would travel along Porden Avenue, and then it would swing down to the School for the Deaf, and then back up to do a loop, and then back up to Roblin or Porden. So you really needed to pay attention because it was a good half-hour wait for the bus coming back again. So this is the Charleswood Parkway, and it was built in 2002, and it was, Rod will appreciate this, named after William R. Clement, the former city councillor, and it was renamed in 2010. So back in 1912, this area was cleared and drained for a golf course. And it was originally known as the Elmhurst Golf Course, then Elcrest Golf Course, and eventually became Charleswood Golf Course. So the beautiful parkway leads to a fabulous long-awaited Charleswood Bridge and has a greenway on either side with a bike path. It's fabulous.
And a dog park. And a dog park.
Oh yeah, it's got a dog park to the south. Yeah. So Elcrest was actually the name of the railway station in Charleswood, which eventually became Pacific Junction. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. And I actually think the area looks better now as a parkway and the pathway than it ever did as a golf course. So these are a couple of the slides on the Charleswood Bridge. The bridge was actually built in 1995, and there's a series of historic plaques on the bridge. Some of the photos depict some of the early life in Charleswood, such as the many mink ranches that existed in this area, run by the families such as the Perts and the Renanders. This one picture shows a footbridge going across to Assiniboine Park from St. James. So Smithdale, in 1847, John George Smith and Hannah Smith arrived in Canada. He was a former soldier commissioned by the Hudson Bay Company to guard its interest in the fur trade. They traveled from England to the Davis Strait to Hudson Bay, and then from York Factory to Winnipeg. Their son, John Jr., was born in this new land before they reached their final destination. So upon completion of his contract, John Sr. was given land where Great West Life now stands. He eventually bought 400 acres of land on both sides of the Assiniboine, and these consisted of river lots 17 and 18. And their farmhouse was on the south side of the Assiniboine, close to the footbridge in Assiniboine Park. John farmed this land until his passing in 1874, leaving the land to his sons John Jr. and Patrick. The two brothers operated the land until 1904, and they sold the property in 1905 to the city of Winnipeg. And the city purchased the land, 283 acres, for $39,903 for the purpose of establishing a public park, Assiniboine Park. So the next generation, John's son, John Jr.'s son, Robert, he and his wife Jessie purchased land in Charleswood near Smith Street, which is now Elcrest, and that's the last street on the north side of Roblin before the Charleswood Bridge. So they established their own river lot farm, but later sold part of their property for the construction of Chapman School. And Robert and Jessie had 4 sons, and their family were members of the St. Mary's Anglican Church on Roblin Boulevard. And the local families were, at that time, there was lots of fun times swimming in the river in the summer and having skating, tobogganing, and snowshoeing parties in the winter. So by the beginning of the war years, Robert had sold most of his land. But in 1938, with their father's help, Robert's sons built their first full service station on the remaining piece of property on the north side of Robin Boulevard. And this is now the site of the Charleswood Veterinary Clinic. And their father ran the business during the war years while they were away. But when they came back, they took up the business again. And both brothers eventually went to work for the Portage Avenue Ford plant, and MacDonald's aircraft plant as overhaul mechanics. So George Thomas Chapman, born in 1861. In 1882, he came from England with the Barrett brothers and took on the enterprise of a market garden. In 1889, he married Catherine Bork. The couple built a log cabin out of maple trees hewn from their own property. This was the first of 3 homes they'd built in Charleswood. This site that they built on was in the vicinity of the volleyball courts in the west part of the Assiniboine Park. And the Chapman property was quite extensive. And in 1914, when their beautiful large house was built, it was equipped with all the modern amenities. Light was provided by the Winnipeg Electric Company, and a private water and sewage system had been installed. They had a sprawling lawn with a tennis court, bowling greens, flower and vegetable gardens. The water was supplied by an artesian well directly below the house. It was pumped into a large tank for further use throughout the building. The house furnishings and fixtures were of a high quality. And when the house was demolished, many of the fine woodwork and glasswork preserved was relocated to Cairn House that we spoke of earlier in tribute to the Chapmans. The Chapman's son Walter actually had a tree nursery at the west end of what we know as the Assiniboine Park. So Mr. Chapman, George, served as chairman of the first school board in St. James and was for several years a member of the Assiniboine Council. When Charleswood was formed its first council in 1912, he became the first reeve, and with the exception of 1 year, served from 1912 to 1928 when he retired. The first church in the area, the St. Mary's Anglican, was built on land donated by Mr. Chapman, and it's located at the southeast corner of Haney Street and Robin Boulevard, right by the Parkway. The congregation formed in 1913, but the church wasn't built until 1922, and Chapman School is named after him. So as long as I can remember, anything east of Haney Street, we always called the village. And this is where almost all the commercial activity in Charleswood was. So the first subdivision in the area was called Roslyn Gardens, and it's now known as Elmhurst Road, which was once set on fire. In the 50s and 60s, they used to oil the roads in Charleswood. And one summer day, one of the local kids, who shall remain nameless, decided he was going to follow the oil truck lighting matches. So he's following the truck, he's lighting matches, flicking these matches and flicking them on the freshly oiled road, which he set on fire, to the point that the truck had to stop oiling the road and leave the vicinity. So over a Christmas dinner a few years ago, my family got talking about some of the crazy things that we did when we were young. And over time, when talking to other friends who grew up in Charleswood in other areas, it seems there were a lot of young firebugs back in those days, enough that my family thought the Historical Society should have an evening called Fireside Chats to listen to some of the confessions. And we figured by now the statute of limitations would have expired on any of the crimes. So some of the early families to build in this area were the Keddys, the Bettesworths, and the Chiswells. The first post office at this end of Charleswood was Pacific Junction, and it was followed by the Charleswood Post Office. Roblin Boulevard was first graveled in 1920, and by 1928, the province declared it a highway. As a child, I remember the doctor we had in the area was Dr. Dugan, who was later joined by Dr. Lay. And when Dr. Dugan retired, Dr. Lay was joined by Dr. Hugh Provis. The kids referred to Dr. Provis as the Jolly Green Giant He was very tall, very jovial, not at all green. He had big dark rimmed glasses, smoked a pipe, and the kids loved him. He was just a great guy. At that time, if you went to the office for an appointment, the cost was $2. If it was a house call, it was required $4. Sometimes, because of farm work, people required house calls, which would mean a late evening for the doctor. The doctors were housed above Mel's barber shop. Mel Curl was a well-loved local barber. His shop was on Roblin Boulevard, close to Hendon. He had a great sense of humor. The kids would come in telling him just how they wanted their haircut. But he knew who was paying the bills, so the parents always won out. I think Mel cut the hair of every male child in Charleswood. The movers and shakers. There were businesses in the 20s and 30s, such as Chester's Store, the Red and White, and later on there was the Bloomer family, who opened Bloomer's IGA. In 1961, Bloomers constructed the Charleswood Hotel. The exterior of the hotel was designed by Jim Willer, a local resident at the time. He also designed the sundial sculpture and two hanging screens from 1959, which used to be out in front of Polo Park. The hotel closed in about 2009 and is now the site of the Red River Co-op gas bar. Shelmardine's Nursery, that many of you would be familiar with, was originally located on Roblin Boulevard between Laxdale and Princeton Boulevard. Some of the restaurants over the years were the White Castle, the Willows, and eventually the Dairy King. This was owned by the Mateos family, brothers and cousins who had come over from Greece. It was our first introduction to fabulous burgers. It was a favorite hangout of all the teenagers in the Charleswood and Tuxedo and parts of River Heights. Nowadays, there's lots of places to eat in Charleswood. Sanderson's Dry Goods was a clothing store with a history that went back to 1948. It was eventually bought by a fellow by the name of Ike Kraut. Ike operated it as Sanderson's for quite a while, but later renamed it the Charleswood Department Store, although all the local kids always called it Ike's. He ran a successful business for almost 60 years until his passing in 2014 at the age of 81. There are other businesses like Searles Hardware, Vialou Electric. Ernie Vialou, as I mentioned earlier, served as municipal councilor. Bill Crocker opened Charleswood Building Supplies in 1956 with the help of the Bloomer family. Bloomers provided the land at minimal cost. Mr. Crocker's growing success required him to move the business a number of times in order to expand it. Not all of the people in Charleswood who had a big impact were politicians or businessmen. Some were just regular people performing incredible service to their community. Lillian James was one of those people. Lillian, from 1895 to 1990, was a longtime member of the community who volunteered and at the tender age of 14, was the youngest member to train in home nursing with the St. John's Ambulance Brigade Nursing Division. During the First World War, through 1919 flu epidemic, she served with the Winnipeg Women's Volunteer Reserve. She had a major role in caring for flu victims, and it was to her credit that no Charleswood residents died due to the pandemic. With no known cure, she risked her own life, taking necessities of life to her patients. And by the end of 1919, 60,000 Canadians had died from the flu. In the Second World War, she established a cadet corps of young women who were too young to serve in the adult corps of St. John's Ambulance. As a provincial corps officer for the cadet division, she was honored by King George VI for her contribution, one of the many honors she received. She came from a family known for community service and was an active leader and contributor in many community organizations, such as the Girl Guides, Eastern Star, Charleswood Horticultural Society, Charleswood Historical Society, and she was nominated by us for a Woman of Distinction in the Winnipeg Free Press in 2019. Lillian saw what needed to be done and worked diligently towards achieving those goals. She was a leader during challenging times when action was required. and community sports were few. She went about her tasks with a friendly smile and was one of the first women in the area to wear pants, which were much more practical on the farm. She came from an athletic family, successful in sports. Both her brother Eddie and her nephew Jerry were inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame.
She's part of the famous Jerry James family?
Yeah, she is.
Holy moly. I
Yeah,
would have never known that.
yeah, she was quite a lady. In fact, people, she was just a going concern, and people would see her, bustling along, going down the street, and they'd stop to offer her a ride. And of course, the streets were so bad back then, and she just thought she could probably get there faster walking between the cars, bumping and jumping along these muddy roads.
Well, you know what? I think she's probably more famous than her brothers now that I think about it. Holy moly.
Yeah, she was very well loved in the area, I'll tell you.
We need a Lillian James now during COVID.
Yeah, that's for sure. Anyway, she's pretty inspiring, isn't she?
Yes.
Okay, so now we're going to go a little east again. And so we're going to talk about the land south of the Assiniboine Park, which again was a former Smith farm. So this site has had many lives. This map shows the Assiniboine River on the right, Assiniboine Park beside it, and to the left in green is land that was planned to be the University of Manitoba. Some of this land is now the Tuxedo Golf Course in the Assiniboine Forest. And we do have, not this particular map, but we do have a 1912 map of the city in our museum showing these original plans. So originally built in 1921, the building on the left, this building served as a residential school for deaf students from across the prairies. And the section of this particular part of the building was called Founders Hall. And from 1941 to 1944, it served as a training center for the No. 3 wireless school operators during the Second World War. It trained both wireless air gunners and ground signal officers as part of the Commonwealth Air Training Program. And so there's a lot more that would have been behind this particular building. While operations were transferred to Calgary in 1944, the Air Force continued to use the site until March 1945. I'm going to give you a little side story here about another lady in Charleswood. Her name was Gladys Bunn, and she came with her parents to Charleswood in 1914. She taught piano lessons for 65 years. My husband sitting beside me here took piano lessons from her, and I guess when he kept hauling his hockey equipment with him, she realized his heart really wasn't in it and thought maybe he should save his parents some money. Anyway, that wasn't in my notes, but so she taught piano lessons for 65 years in Charleswood and the surrounding areas. She also played for her church and local dance bands. And Gladys was an artist. She painted china, handkerchiefs, oil paintings. She did tallying, ceramics, other crafts. But many of the young officers that came from other parts of the Commonwealth to train at the wireless operation here bought some of her artwork to take home to loved ones. So we have a display of her artwork in our museum, and she's a pretty talented lady. So back to the school. After the wireless school, it became home to Manitoba Normal School for training teachers from 1946 to 1965. And at this time, the remaining H huts and another building on the property were loaned out for a 2-year period to the city of Winnipeg, and they served as emergency housing for about 100 families. The school facilities were made available for 45 children from grades 1 to grade 6, and then the older kids would have been farmed out to some of the other schools in the area. So the school, this particular section of the school, which went by several names, different names through this time, closed in 1953. It once again returned to its original function as a school for the deaf in 65 to 96. And after that served the admin center for the Pan Am Games in 1999 and is currently the site of the Manitoba Mennonite University. And you can see the new building on the right side here. So at the south end of the Assiniboine Forest is the Hart Trail. And it was the first rail to trails conversion in Winnipeg. And it follows a former bed of the Grand Trunk rail line, Grand Trunk Pacific Rail Line. It was later acquired by CN, and this line was a major transportation route from 1894 to 1972. After the CN abandoned the line, the track was used for a few years by the Prairie Dog Central Steam Train. And the land was later transferred to the city of Winnipeg to become parts of streets and parks and planned for Charleswood. Fortunately, the city was persuaded to declare it a public green space with the plans of it becoming part of the Trans-Canada Trail. The name Hart Trail, we've got a plaque dedicated there, comes from the old rail subdivision that once existed in this area. And you can see in this picture that there's still parts of the old rail bed there. So the Hart Trail was officially opened on July 2nd, 2000, and Trans-Canada Relay runners carried the ceremonial waters from the Arctic and Pacific Oceans along the trail as part of their route to across Canada. The relay culminated in Ottawa to meet the Eastern relay teams carrying waters from the Atlantic Ocean. So this plaque just east of Elmhurst indicates the location of Pacific Junction Station and the Searle grain elevator that used to stand here. The elevator was torn down in 1978. So Friends of the Hart Trail worked tirelessly in acquiring the site of the rail bed east of Elmhurst. And this project was supported by the Winnipeg Trails Association, who accessed funding from all three levels of government. And the Hart Trail is now 6.5 kilometers long. And at the east end, it connects with Preston Trail, which allows users traveling north to Assiniboine Park. At Shaftesbury, south of Wilkes, it connects to Thundering Bison Trail, which I had the pleasure of naming. And it takes you along Sterling Line Parkway or south to Fort White Alive. Going west, it follows the roadbed to the Perimeter Highway and continues along on the opposite side of the perimeter as the Grand Trunk Trail line. I love cycling, so I often bike out to Charleswood and beyond, and you can bike to a lot of these parks without spending a lot of time on busy streets. It's just fabulous. So we've come back to the west end of Charleswood, and I'd like to mention one more family. Adrian Van Roon came to Charleswood from Holland in 1919, and he was looking for good farmland, which is exactly what he found in Charleswood. The Van Roon the home was built on Charleswood Road just north of Wilkes in 1929. So Adrian at the time worked as a streetcar conductor, but he lost his job after being diagnosed with cancer, as there were no disability benefits in those days. At this time, he started a poultry farm. And though he passed away in 1931, his wife and son, Len, managed to keep the business going. After Len married, his family continued in the poultry business. His family delivered eggs to private customers as far away as River Heights. In later years, the trend in the industry was to move to much bigger operations. It was at this time that Len gave up the poultry business and went to work for the city of Winnipeg, looking after the Iroquois Arena. He and his wife, Verna, were very active in the community, and Verna was one of the first members of the Historical Society. They both helped guide the Historical Society for many years. And in 2003, they published a very popular book called Photos and Fragments of Charleswood's History. Hundreds of copies have been sold, with proceeds going to the Historical Society, and we still get requests for copies from people all across Canada. And I owe thanks to them and other contributors to their book, my brother Dan, and also the Manitoba Historical Society, as a lot of the information I'm sharing with you tonight has been gleaned from them. And it's kind of ironic, this book that they printed, originally, Mr. Van Roon thought, oh, you know, we should just print maybe 50. And Verna was quite a going concern. She said, no, we're going to print 100. And, you know, like they just sold out so fast. And again, as I mentioned, we sold hundreds of them. So Len has been called upon as a speaker for many years, and he will be celebrating his 100th birthday on the 1st of December. So there are two subdivisions in Charleswood, Ridgewood West and Scotswood Meadows. So the area is still growing and there are new people moving in with many new memories to be made. And this brings us to the end of our tour, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd like you to know that the Charleswood Historical Society meets once a month. Our museum is open Saturdays from 2 till 4, or tours can be arranged by the appointment. We follow COVID guidelines. We normally hold an annual picnic at Cairn Park in June, a potluck dinner in February, an annual pioneer dinner in October. Our monthly lectures are open to everyone. You don't have to be a member. So please consider taking one in when we get them going again. And as you can see, we have a lot going on. The Society also has a website, so please take a look to learn more about us at charleswoodhistoricalsociety.ca. You don't have to be in Charleswood to join us, and we're happy to welcome new members of all ages. A single membership is $15 and $20 for a family. Thank you so much for your attention, and we're back to the cenotaph, which is still part of Charleswood Square Mile. Thanks again. I hope I didn't go on too long.
Eileen, you did fantastic. Would you be open to a few questions, Eileen?
Sure. I hope I can answer them.
Well, if you can, I'm sure you can point us in the right direction.
Okay.
Any questions from the participants, audience out there, please? Just speak up.
Yes, I have a question. That book, okay, now I used to live in Charleswood, so I know a lot of the areas that you're talking about.
Okay.
That book that you talked about, what I missed that. What was that? And is it available, and what is it called?
Sure. It's called Photos and Fragments
Okay.
of Charleswood's History.
Sorry?
Of Charleswood's history.
Okay.
And if you have an opportunity to pop in at the
There it is.
Charleswood Museum anytime,
Okay.
we would have them available there.
Oh, okay.
Or if Martin wants to give you my email address, I can hook you up with getting the books. And
Sure.
it's got a lot of the information I told you, lots more. You know, I did a run through with somebody else from our group, and they said, you know, it could be 2 lectures because there is so much I didn't get an opportunity to cover. Robin Park area in Charleswood, designated VLA land.
Yeah.
The veterans coming back. I barely covered the east end of Charleswood, and the area.
I agree, and I did live in the east end of Charleswood on Elmhurst actually. So.
Did you?
Yeah.
So you may have known who set fire to that school. I'm not saying.
If I ever knew, I wouldn't say.
Yeah, but
are there anyone else out there with a question or a comment?
Yeah, I'd like to. Okay,
Go ahead.
I'd like to know, what is the address of the museum?
it's 5006 Roblin Boulevard.
Oh yeah, well, okay.
Is that the old library, correct?
It's near the old library. It actually used to be the Charleswood Municipal Office.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yes, the old library was just beside it. And the fire hall, the new fire hall is directly east of it.
Yeah.
So the streets it would be between would be Dieppe Road and Hearthstone Road.
Yeah. I used to walk there from my house in Elmhurst.
Oh, did you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I did the same from Bramble over to the library. I got my first library card there.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, I got my first one there too.
Is Mr. Van Ruin well enough to go to a Remembrance Day ceremony this year?
I
Just about
don't
100?
know. You know, the poor man, my God, he's going to be 100, as I mentioned, and he has just had a rough year.
Oh,
He's had a couple of falls, and one of them, he actually broke his neck.
Oh,
So
yeah.
he's got a neck brace that he's been having adjusted every few weeks. But he's a going concern, I'll tell you, because if you go down to the museum, he'll probably be there. He's quite often there. He loves being there, and he loves talking to people.
Well, I have never lived in Charleswood, but as you're speaking, it sounded like there were a huge number of parks in Charleswood. Do you have any idea how many parks there
Yes,
are?
I actually did my one and only previous presentation was on the parks of Charleswood. Part of my job with the Charleswood Historical Society for many years has been to look after street names and parks. And so there's actually about 50 green spaces in Charleswood. Now, by green spaces, I have to tell you, there's a couple that are maybe a block long and 15 yards wide, but there are a lot of parks out there. And a lot of them are named after longtime Charleswood residents. A lot of the streets in the new development in Ridgewood West, we were very fortunate. The developer I worked with really only had to give us 3 streets named after local residents. And I just had a really good time working with them, and they gave us 17, which is fabulous. But yeah, a lot of the parks, for instance, from Karen House that I mentioned, I do a ton of cycling. I love being on my bike. And so I actually live in White Ridge. And so I can go from my place in White Ridge through Fort White, down through the Hart Trail, all the way out to Westdale, down Dale Boulevard, into where Karen House is in River West Park. And I can still go through another tiny little park, is Daly Park, which connects River West Park through to Willow Ridge to South Boyne. I can go down South Boyne to Berkeley Street, where the passage is, and past Kelly Landing, where my great-grandparents lived, and through Boschman Park, back behind the Charleswood Legion and where the Charleswood School was, connect to, I'll forget the name of that street, Shelmerdine Drive, I think it is. And there's another park there named Bannatyne Park. You probably would have heard of W.B. Bannatyne, who was, well, like Bannatyne Street was named after him. He was very involved in the city of Winnipeg. Well, their family's been out in Charleswood for years. They actually, Bannatyne Park is right just west of, I don't know if you're familiar where Vassal used to be, Charleswood Care Center. So their park is just walking steps from there. And they actually owned a pig farm on the south side of Roblin Boulevard. So I can ride my bike through there and not be on Roblin Boulevard and cut back through Charleswood and get back onto the Parkway.
You know what's interesting of all these, this history of Charleswood, is there a cemetery in Charleswood?
Not that I know of. It's funny you should ask though, because we had a very strange request, which we didn't answer because we thought it might be somebody that would hack us, but somebody saying that they were in a new area. I don't know if it was a newer-
Isn't there one behind the St. Charles Catholic Church? There's a graveyard there.
Oh, behind St. Charles Catholic Church, yes, there is. But not in Charleswood. And there would have been a number of people from Charleswood would be buried over there. Like my mom, for instance, I mean, she's not buried there, but my mom growing up would have gone to church at St. Charles. They would have gone to church by ferry.
Mhm.
In fact, my older siblings and my cousins, I don't know if I was ever on the ferry, but my siblings and my older cousin definitely would have gone on the ferry across to St. Charles. Now,
So you were saying about someone had a request about the cemetery?
well, there's a new apartment building that's gone up behind the Westdale Hotel. And somebody sent an email to us wondering if there was a cemetery there, or if there were, I don't know, there were bodies, if they were concerned about bodies being disturbed, because they said a couple of strange things had happened in their home since the digging had started. And so nobody we know knows anything about it. And it was kind of a different email address. So I just thought, you know, I really don't want to be hacked. So we kind of just let that one go. But no.
Sorry for bringing that up.
Pardon me?
I'm sorry for bringing that up.
Yeah, well, but you know, somebody, I don't know about any cemeteries, but somebody had asked about an orphanage. And at the time, I didn't like, I knew that the Oddfellows, that there had been some children there, but I wasn't really sure at that time that it had been an orphanage. And it really was just an orphanage for their members' children. But they're going a little west of Charleswood. There was an orphanage just over west of the Perimeter Bridge, between there and Camp Manitou, like in the area of the new development there. This beautiful new development between the Perimeter Highway and the cemetery, Chapel Lawn. And so in that area, there was a cemetery. And a lady by the name of Jean Amateur with the Charleswood, well, she is a member of ours, but she's with the Headingley Historical Society. She's got a wealth of information about, you know, that side as well.
Okay, if there a couple more minutes, any other questions?
Eileen, was your maiden name Kelly?
My grandmother was Grace Kelly.
The Grace Kelly?
No, I only wish
Oh.
to have that money.
Oh,
But no, my great grandfather was Patrick Kelly, and
okay.
his wife was Mary Grace. My grandmother was Grace, and she married Daniel Flood.
Wow, yeah.
And
I
then,
didn't know all these names were Charleswood associated, but we've all heard of a lot of those names.
and then
Now,
my
there was a family, a large family, went to St. Ignatius, last name of Kelly. Were they related to these Kellys you're talking about? He was a contractor.
yeah, that was probably my mom's cousin Pat, and
Okay.
they had a big family. There's,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
we still keep in touch with some of them. But
Yeah.
yeah, they were a big family.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yes.
My
Okay.
family.
Debbie, you had something, Debbie?
Yeah, I was just curious, when you were growing up, I mean, it sounded like Charleswood was just all enclosed and all community. What did you think of Winnipeg? Did you do all your shopping and everything right in Charleswood? And was Winnipeg a distant place, or?
Oh my God, Winnipeg was such a, we were considered the sticks. Charleswood was always considered the sticks. There was nothing going on out there. And so it was just all, I mean, it was wonderful growing up because we had all these huge open fields, but shopping, well, there was Sanderson's store that I mentioned earlier that Ike Kraut bought and eventually renamed Charleswood department store. But going down to Polo Park, it was a treat. Oh, I'm telling you. I mean, it was a big ordeal. I remember my mom's sister would take us to the paddock
Yeah.
across from Polo Park there. And oh man, what a treat. And of course, as teenagers, well, I mean, we were down at Polo Park all the time, but getting down there by bus was a huge ordeal. I mean, seemed to take about an hour. But yeah, there was like the only stores, there were no real like clothing stores at our end. Where Kelly's store was, as I said, I grew up on Municipal Road and we were only a few houses down from Robin Boulevard. And so Kelly's store was like still existed there. It was at that time it was run by a family by the name of Andrews. Like after Kelly's, it became Craig's store, and then a family by the name of Andrews bought it, and then he eventually went out of business. And then when I mentioned the West End Food Mart and the chip stand, like that was the West End Food Mart was in business when I was growing up as well. And so we could buy, you know, groceries and things like that there. But any clothing, you had to go downtown to the Bay or Polo, I don't even know if Polo Park was even, I mean, I was a kid when Polo Park was built. But, you know, we picked up a lot of things at Sanderson's. But that was, I think, the only clothing store in Charleswood at the time.
But I have to say, Eileen, we have to bring you back. This has been fascinating.
Mhm.